Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. Deer Woman, Olympic National Park, 2011. Connor Hayes had always believed that forests were systems, predictable, mappable, governed by ecology rather than mystery. After 8 years as a ranger in Olympic National Park, he'd reduced the Hoh rainforest to data points. 140 inches of annual rainfall, 300-foot Sitka spruces, Roosevelt elk migration patterns documented in his field notebooks with the precision of a man who'd minored in biology before the Park Service recruited him. The forest was not magical. It was Picea sitchensis and Pseudotsuga menziesii, nurse logs and nitrogen cycles, a temperate rainforest whose mist could be explained by Pacific maritime air masses colliding with the Olympic mountains. Nothing more. That conviction began to collapse on October 19, 2011, when Rachel Whitmore's emergency contact called to report she'd missed 3 scheduled check-ins. Connor stood in the ranger station at the Hoh Rainforest Visitor Center, holding the intake form that dispatch had faxed over. Rachel Whitmore, 28, solo hiker, naturalist photographer. Last known position, mile 9.2 on the Hoh River Trail, heading toward the Blue Glacier route. She'd registered her itinerary on October 14th, 5 days ago. Experienced backpacker. Carried a Garmin eTrex GPS unit, a satellite phone for emergencies. The kind of hiker who didn't make mistakes. Could be equipment failure, said Dave Kessler, the other ranger on duty, a 20-year veteran with a gut that strained against his uniform. Sat phone dies. She's just out of contact. Connor studied the topographic map spread across the desk, tracing the Hoh River Trail with his finger. The trail followed the river valley for 17.3 miles before climbing toward Glacier Meadows and the Blue Glacier. Dense temperate rainforest for the first 12 miles, then subalpine forest, then glacial terrain above 4,000 feet. The area Rachel had been hiking was the transition zone, where the moss-draped lowland forest gave way to something steeper, less forgiving. She would have turned back by now if it was just equipment, Connor said. 5 days overdue? She'd have self-rescued. Dave shrugged, already reaching for his radio to call in the search and rescue team. Protocol. By the book. Connor appreciated that, even as a knot of unease formed in his stomach, the kind of feeling he normally dismissed as irrational, the biological residue of ancestral humans who'd feared the dark before understanding evolution. He gathered his gear methodically. Motorola CP200 two-way radio fully charged, Garmin GPS 60 CSX with fresh batteries, first aid kit, topographic maps in a waterproof sleeve, water purification tablets, emergency bivvy, his field notebook, the one he'd filled with observations about fungal networks and canopy moisture levels, data that meant something in the world he understood. The Hoh rainforest swallowed him whole the moment he left the visitor center parking lot. The trail began in what guidebooks called the Hall of Mosses, a misleading name that made tourists think of something quaint, manageable. Connor knew better. The forest here was a cathedral of excess. Big leaf maples draped with 20-foot curtains of club moss, sword ferns taller than a man, nurse logs 6 feet in diameter colonized by hemlock seedlings. The air hung thick with moisture, not quite rain but not quite mist, a suspension of water that beaded on every surface. Sound dampened strangely here. His boots on the trail produced a muffled rhythm, as if the moss carpeting the earth absorbed all evidence of human passage. He'd hiked this trail 100 times. He knew every switchback, every river crossing, every campsite. But today, maybe it was knowing someone was missing, or maybe it was the quality of light filtering through the canopy, green and submarine. The forest felt different. Watchful. He dismissed the thought immediately. Anthropomorphization. The human brain's tendency to project consciousness onto the indifferent natural world. At mile 3, 4, he passed the campsite where a family from Seattle had set up tents. They'd registered yesterday, planning a short overnight. Connor verified they were safe, showed them Rachel's photograph printed from the NPS database. Young woman, dark hair pulled into a practical ponytail, hazel eyes that looked directly at the camera with the confidence of someone comfortable in wilderness. "Haven't seen her," the father said, "but we only got here yesterday afternoon." Connor continued up trail, documenting his position every half mile in his notebook. Mile 5.8, mile 7.2. The forest deepened around him. The moss grew thicker, transforming the landscape into something Dr. Seuss might have illustrated if he'd worked in horror. Trees became abstract sculptures, their branches twisted at impossible angles, draped with growths that looked less like plants and more like the beards of drowned giants. The Hoh River churned alongside the trail, glacier-fed in the color of dissolved stone. Its sound a constant white noise that made Connor's radio checks with Dave feel like messages from another planet. Mile 9.2, Connor said into his radio, approaching Rachel Whitmore's last documented position. Static answered him. Then Dave's voice crackling, "Copy that. Anything?" "Not yet." He knew what he was looking for. Abandoned gear, torn fabric caught on branches, disturbed soil, blood. The forensic evidence of disaster. But the trail showed nothing. No signs of struggle. No indication anyone had passed this way recently except the deep track of elk hooves pressed into mud, and Connor stopped walking. There, just off the trail, maybe 15 feet into the forest, a camera. A Nikon D90 with a telephoto lens, sitting on top of a moss-covered log as if someone had carefully placed it there. His pulse quickened despite himself. He approached carefully, documenting the position with his GPS, 47.8156 degree ON, 123.8673 degree W. The camera sat perfectly level, lens cap still on, no visible damage. Connor pulled a pair of nitrile gloves from his pack, protocol for handling potential evidence, and picked it up. The LCD screen flickered to life when he pressed the power button. Battery at 47%. Memory card 3/4 full. He scrolled through the images. Sitka spruce canopy shots, close-ups of banana slugs, artistic compositions of nurse logs. Rachel Whitmore had a good eye. The timestamps showed she'd been shooting actively through October 16th, 3 days ago. The last photograph, taken at 14:37, showed a section of forest maybe 50 yards off trail. Nothing remarkable. Just trees and moss and the endless green twilight of the rainforest understory. Connor stared at the image, zooming in on the LCD screen. Something about the composition bothered him. The way Rachel had centered the frame on what appeared to be empty forest, as if she'd been photographing something that wasn't there, or something that had moved before the shutter clicked. He bagged the camera in an evidence pouch and continued up trail, but his thoughts spiraled around that last photograph. Why would she set down an expensive camera in the middle of the forest? Photographers didn't do that. They carried their equipment obsessively, protected it like children. Unless she'd been running. The hypothesis formed against his will. Rachel sees something, puts down the camera to move faster, intends to come back for it. Never does. But running from what? Black bears avoided humans. Cougars were rare, mostly active at dawn and dusk. Elk were dangerous during rut, but the bulls didn't charge unprovoked. Connor's rational mind cycled through the wildlife inventory of Olympic National Park, finding nothing that explained an experienced hiker fleeing so completely she'd abandon a $2,000 camera. At mile 10.8, he found the first piece of clothing. A fleece jacket, dark blue, hanging from a branch at shoulder height. Deliberately placed, not torn or scattered. Connor documented the position, photographed it from multiple angles, then examined it carefully. Women's size medium. The label inside read Patagonia, Rachel's according to her gear list. No blood, no tears, no signs of violence, just a jacket hung on a branch like a marker or a warning. The thought came unbidden, and Connor shoved it away. He was a scientist. He dealt in evidence, not atmospherics. But the forest seemed to press closer as he bagged the jacket, the moss-heavy silence broken only by the river's constant grinding whisper and the occasional crack of a branch settling somewhere in the green depths. He radioed Dave. Found Rachel Whitmore's camera at mile 9.2, jacket at 10.8. Both items placed, not dropped. Continuing search. You want backup? Dave's voice sounded very far away. Connor checked his watch. 15:47. He had maybe 2 hours of good daylight left, less under the canopy. Not yet. I'm going to push to mile 12, see if she made it to the ranger station at Olympus. Copy. Check in at 17 or I'm sending SR. Connor continued up trail, but now he found himself scanning the forest with new intensity. Looking for what? He couldn't articulate. Rachel's gear appearing in sequence suggested she'd been moving up trail, shedding weight. Heat exhaustion? Possible, but October temperatures rarely exceeded 55 degrees. Hypothermia? In the rain, yes, but she'd have sought shelter, not climbed higher. Psychological break? Statistically rare among experienced hikers. At mile 11.6, he found her backpack. It sat in the middle of the trail upright, leaning against a massive nurse log. Connor approached slowly, some animal part of his brain screaming that this was wrong, that the progression of evidence was too deliberate, too staged. He photographed the pack from every angle before examining it. A Granite Gear Crown 60-liter pack, exactly what Rachel had registered with the backcountry office. Connor opened it carefully. Inside, sleeping bag, tent, camp stove, 3 days of food, water filter, first aid kit, rain gear. Everything an experienced hiker would carry. Everything except the items she'd apparently discarded along the trail. And something else. Tucked into the top pocket, Connor found a field notebook similar to his own. He opened it expecting trail notes and wildlife observations. Instead, he found sketches, page after page of them, drawn in increasingly frantic pencil strokes. Trees. Always trees. But the proportions were wrong, the branches too long, reaching like fingers. And in several drawings, barely visible among the sketched forest, a figure. Female, human from certain angles, but Connor's hands started to shake, a physiological response he couldn't control. The figure in Rachel's drawings had legs that bent backward at the knee, and where feet should be, the sketches showed something split, cloven, like... He closed the notebook and shoved it back into the pack, his breath coming faster than exertion warranted. His scientific training wrestled with the primal unease spreading through his chest. Rachel Whitmore had documented something, had seen something, had tried to capture it on paper with the desperate urgency of someone whose camera couldn't. The forest around him remained perfectly still. No bird calls, no rustle of small mammals. Just the river's grinding voice and the moss-filtered light turning everything the color of deep water. Connor radioed Dave, trying to keep his voice level. Found Rachel's pack at mile 11.6, all gear present, continuing to Olympus Station. Static. Then, Connor, what's going on up there? Just finding things. Regular intervals, like she left a trail. A trail to what? Connor looked up the path ahead, where it curved into deeper forest. That's what I'm trying to figure out. He hoisted Rachel's pack alongside his own. It would be evidence needed to be brought back, and continued hiking as the afternoon light began its slow fade. The trail climbed now, gaining elevation as it approached the transition zone between temperate rainforest and subalpine forest. The character of the vegetation changed. The massive Sitka spruces gave way to smaller western hemlocks. The understory thinned slightly, and gaps appeared in the canopy where Connor could glimpse gray sky. At mile 12.3, Connor saw the woman. She stood perhaps 80 yards up trail, partially obscured by a massive hemlock trunk. Long dark hair, slender frame, wearing what looked like buckskin clothing, though the distance and failing light made details uncertain. Connor's heart lurched. Rachel? And he called out, Rachel Whitmore? Park Service. The figure didn't respond, didn't move, just stood there, one hand resting against the tree trunk in a posture that was somehow both casual and utterly wrong. Connor started forward quickly, pulling his flashlight from his belt, even though enough daylight remained. Rachel, are you injured? Can you hear me? The woman turned her head, or Connor thought she did, the movement so subtle he might have imagined it, and then she was gone. Not running away, not ducking behind the tree, just absent, as if she'd been erased from the frame. Connor reached the hemlock at a near run, breathing hard. No one. He circled the tree, scanning the surrounding forest. No footprints in the soft earth, no disturbed vegetation, no evidence anyone had stood there. But he'd seen her. Seen something, hadn't he? His radio crackled. "Connor, it's 17. Status?" He stared at the empty forest, his mouth dry. I'm at mile 12-3. Thought I saw someone but lost visual. Could have been Rachel. Could have been. The light's getting bad, I might have..." He stopped. Might have what? Hallucinated? "I'm going to set up emergency camp, continue search at first light." A pause, then Dave's voice, carefully neutral. "You sure you don't want backup?" Connor looked down and noticed his hands were trembling again. He forced them still. "I'm sure. We'll check in at 8 or tomorrow. Watch yourself up there." Connor signed off and found a flat spot 30 yards off trail to set up his emergency bivvy. Standard protocol. Never camp directly on the trail. Maintain visibility of the path. Keep gear organized for rapid response. He moved through the familiar motions, trying to ignore the way the forest seemed to watch him work. Anthropomorphization, he told himself. The human brain's tendency to project consciousness. But as darkness fell and the rainforest transformed into something vast and alien, Connor sat in his bivvy with his headlamp illuminating a small circle of normalcy, and couldn't shake the memory of that figure. The way she'd stood, the casual wrongness of her posture. He pulled out Rachel's notebook and began examining the sketches more carefully. The drawings grew more detailed toward the end. The figure appearing in them was definitely female, definitely humanoid, but the proportions were subtly off. Too tall, legs too long. And in the final sketch, drawn with such pressure that the pencil had torn the paper in places, Rachel had captured something that made Connor's scalp prickle. The figure's face was beautiful. Inhumanly, impossibly beautiful. The kind of beauty that wasn't attractive but terrifying, like staring at the sun. And below the buckskin dress, barely visible in Rachel's frantic cross-hatching, the legs ended not in feet, but in something split and cloven. Hoofed. Connor forced himself to think rationally. Rachel had been alone in the forest for days. Isolation could cause hallucinations, especially with dehydration or head trauma. She'd documented her psychological decline in these drawings. He was seeing the evidence of a mental break, nothing more. But even as he thought it, another part of his brain, older, less civilized, whispered, what if she was documenting something real? He tried to sleep but couldn't. The forest was too loud in the darkness. Not loud with sound, the rainforest at night was eerily quiet, but loud with presence. With the weight of attention, Connor lay in his bivvy and listened to the slow drip of moisture from the canopy, each drop hitting moss with a sound like tiny footsteps approaching. At some point past midnight, he heard singing. A woman's voice, distant and clear, singing something wordless and ancient. The melody rose and fell with an irregular rhythm that made his chest tighten, as if his heart was trying to match the cadence and failing. The song came from somewhere up trail, toward the Blue Glacier route. Connor sat up, reaching for his radio. But what would he say? I hear singing? He'd sound insane. And maybe he was. Sleep deprivation and suggestion could produce auditory hallucinations. He'd read the studies. But the singing continued, and Connor found himself standing, pulling on his boots, drawn by a compulsion he couldn't name. He switched on his headlamp and started up trail, following the voice. Somewhere in the rational part of his mind, he knew this was stupid, dangerous, exactly what Rachel must have done. But the song pulled at something deeper than reason. The trail climbed steeply now, switchbacking through increasingly sparse forest. Connor's headlamp beam cut through darkness thick as water. The singing grew clearer, and he realized with a chill that ran from his skull to his heels that he could almost understand the words. Not English, not any language he recognized. But the meaning touched something primal. Come, follow, find. At mile 13.7, his headlamp illuminated fresh tracks, hoofprints, cloven, pressed deep into the mud of the trail. Connor stopped walking. His scientific brain cataloged the evidence. Odocoileus hemionus, black-tailed deer, common in Olympic National Park. Reasonable explanation. Except these prints were too large, and they were spaced wrong. The gait too long, as if something bipedal had made them. The singing stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. Connor stood on the trail, alone in the vast darkness of the rainforest, and felt the weight of a presence he couldn't see. His headlamp beam swept across trees and ferns and moss, finding nothing. But the air had changed, grown thick with something that wasn't moisture. Then he heard it. The sharp click of a hoof on stone, somewhere ahead in the darkness beyond his light's reach. Connor's training screamed at him to turn back, return to his bivvy, wait for dawn and SAR backup. But another part of him, the part that had driven him to become a ranger, to spend his life in forests studying mysteries ecology couldn't fully explain, pushed him forward. He followed the hoofprints up trail. The forest opened as he climbed. The massive trees gave way to smaller subalpine vegetation, and gaps appeared in the canopy where starlight filtered through. Connor could see maybe 50 feet now, his headlamp illuminating a world of silver and shadow. The hoofprints continued, perfectly spaced, leading higher. At 14.1 miles, he found Rachel's boots, both of them placed side by side on a flat rock beside the trail, laces still tied, positioned with the same deliberate care as all her other items. Connor picked one up and found it still damp inside, as if she'd removed it recently. His radio crackled. "Connor, you there?" It was Dave, voice rough with sleep and concern. Connor checked his watch. 03:47. He'd been hiking for hours. "I'm here," Connor said, his voice strange in his own ears. Mile 14.1, found Rachel's boots. "Jesus Christ, Connor, what are you doing hiking in the middle of the night?" "Good question." Connor looked up trail, where the hoofprints continued into darkness. "Following evidence." "That's not. You need to get back to camp and wait for SR. We've got a full team coming up at dawn." "I think I'm close to finding her." "Connor, listen to me. I've worked this park for 20 years. When people start doing irrational shit like hiking alone in the dark, that's when accidents happen. Get back to your bivvy. Now." But Connor was staring at the hoofprints, watching how his headlamp beam caught them at an angle that revealed their depth. Something heavy had made these. Something that walked on two legs despite having hooves. "Connor?" "Acknowledge." "Copy," he said distantly, heading back to camp. He switched off his radio and continued up trail. The scientific part of his mind had gone quiet. In its place, something older operated his body. The biological programming of a male following a female's trail, drawn by signals his conscious mind couldn't process, but his nervous system understood perfectly. The forest no longer felt threatening. It felt inviting, welcoming. The darkness ahead wasn't dangerous, it was a destination. At mile 14.8, the trail opened into a meadow. Connor stepped out of the trees and stopped. The meadow spread before him, maybe 2 acres, bathed in starlight. Avalanche lilies grew in impossible profusion for October, their white petals luminous. And in the center of the meadow, standing among the flowers, was the woman. She was beautiful, not human beautiful, something beyond that, something that made Connor's brain misfire trying to process what he was seeing. Long, dark hair that moved in wind he couldn't feel. High cheekbones and full lips curved in a slight smile. Buckskin dress that clung to a body whose proportions were just slightly wrong, as if an artist had taken human anatomy and refined it past the point of naturalness. And her eyes, when she looked at Connor across the meadow, her eyes were dark and deep and utterly empty of anything he recognized as consciousness. They were beautiful holes in reality, and staring into them made him feel like he was falling. "Hello, Connor," she said, and her voice was the singing he'd heard, was the wind through moss, was the river grinding stone to powder. "I've been waiting for you." Somewhere in the wreckage of his rational mind, Connor wondered how she knew his name. But mostly he just stood there, paralyzed by her beauty and the growing certainty that he was looking at something that couldn't exist. She walked toward him, and Connor's headlamp beam caught her legs. The buckskin dress ended at her knees. Below that, her legs were human in shape but wrong in proportion, too long, joints that bent backward, calves that tapered to impossibly delicate ankles, and her feet. Connor's headlamp shook in his trembling hand as it illuminated what should have been feet but were instead cloven hooves, black and glossy as obsidian. "What are you?" he whispered. She smiled wider, and Connor saw that her teeth were too sharp. "I have many names. The Cowlitz called me Sagali Tai's daughter. The Maka knew me as the Hoofed woman. Your species has always understood what I am, even when you pretend not to believe." Connor tried to step back but found his legs wouldn't obey. The woman, the thing, continued approaching, her hooves making small clicks on the stone beneath the meadow grass. "Where's Rachel?" he managed. "Rachel." The entity tasted the name. "You're female. She's here. She's been here since she followed me 3 days ago, just as you followed me tonight. I want to see her." The dear woman. Because that's what she was, Connor realized with a horror that felt like ice water in his veins. The entity from a dozen Native American tribal traditions. The beautiful woman with deer hooves who lured men to madness and death, gestured toward the far side of the meadow. "Look." Connor's headlamp beam swung across the meadow and found what he'd missed in his initial scan. A figure sitting among the avalanche lilies, back against a subalpine fir. Rachel Whitmore. Barefoot, dressed only in a t-shirt and hiking pants, staring at nothing with eyes that reflected his light like an animal's. "Rachel." Connor started toward her, but the dear woman's hand touched his chest. Her palm was cold as glacial runoff, and he stopped. "She can't hear you," the entity said. "She's with me now. She's been with me since she saw me in the forest and followed, since she tried to photograph me and realized her camera couldn't capture what I am, since she understood that all her science and all her knowledge meant nothing when confronted with something older than her species' memory." Connor looked into those empty, beautiful eyes and felt his sanity beginning to fracture. "This isn't real. You're not real. There's a rational explanation." "Is there?" The dear woman stroked his face with fingers that felt like frozen leather. "Tell me the rational explanation for why you followed hoof prints up a mountain in the middle of the night. Tell me why your camera bag feels heavier every hour you spend in my forest. Tell me why you can't look away from me even though every instinct you have is screaming that I'm wrong." And Connor realized she was right. His backpack felt heavier. Had felt heavier since he'd found Rachel's camera. Since he'd started seeing the entity in his peripheral vision. Since the forest had begun watching him. "What do you want?" he asked. The dear woman smiled. And in that smile, Connor saw the accumulated hunger of something that had been luring human males into forests for thousands of years, collecting them the way he collected data in his field notebooks. "I want what I've always wanted," she said. "What your species offers me again and again, despite all your stories warning against it. Your attention, your obsession, your willingness to abandon everything rational and follow something beautiful into the dark." She leaned close, and her breath smelled like moss and rotting meat. "Rachel gave me 3 days before her mind broke. How long will you last, Connor Hayes?" Connor tried to run, tried to scream, tried to pull out his radio and call for Dave, for SR, for anyone. But his body wouldn't obey. The dear woman's touch had paralyzed him, or maybe it was something deeper, the willing surrender of his rational mind to something it couldn't understand but couldn't resist. She guided him across the meadow to where Rachel sat. Up close, Connor could see that Rachel's eyes were open but seeing nothing. Drool ran from one corner of her mouth. Her hands moved constantly, fingers making small sketching motions in the air, as if she was still trying to draw what she'd seen. "She tried to understand me," the dear woman said, stroking Rachel's hair with terrible tenderness. "Tried to document me, tried to fit me into her framework of biology and ecology and natural history. But I'm not nature, Connor. I'm what lived in these forests before your species invented words like nature. I'm the reason your ancestors told stories about women in the woods. I'm the truth behind every warning your people forgot to believe." Connor's radio crackled. "Connor, if you can hear this, Sayar is en route. ETA 2 hours. Hold position." The deer woman plucked the radio from Connor's belt with casual disdain and crushed it in her hand. The plastic shattered, circuits sparking briefly before dying. "They won't find you in time," she said. "The forest is very large, and I'm very good at hiding what I collect. By the time they reach this meadow, you'll be like Rachel, alive but absent, your mind gone to wherever minds go when they can't process what they've experienced." She settled beside Connor, arranging his body like a doll until he sat next to Rachel, both of them propped against the tree. The deer woman positioned herself between them, one hand resting on each of their heads, and began to sing. The song was the one Connor had heard earlier, but now he understood it. Not the words. There were no words, but the meaning beneath them. It was a song about hunger and patience, about waiting in forests while human generations rose and fell, about the eternal entertainment of watching intelligent creatures abandon intelligence for beauty. Connor felt his mind beginning to slip, felt the careful structures he'd built, the scientific thinking, the rational worldview, the belief that everything could be explained, crumbling under the weight of what he was experiencing. He tried to hold on, tried to catalog what was happening in clinical terms. Hallucination brought on by sleep deprivation and environmental stress, possible exposure to ergot fungus or other hallucinogenic compounds, temporary psychosis that would resolve with medical intervention. But the deer woman's song drowned out his internal monologue, and her hand on his head felt like it was drawing something essential out of him, unspooling his consciousness thread by thread. 8 years in these forests, she murmured, her voice barely audible beneath the song. 8 years of walking past me without seeing, of documenting everything except what mattered. Did you really think your notebooks protected you? Your science? All you did was teach yourself to ignore the warnings. Connor's field notebook lay open in his lap. He watched, detached, as the deer woman picked it up and began reading his observations about fungal networks and moisture levels. She laughed, a sound like branches cracking under ice. "You wrote about everything except what you sensed," she said. "The places on the trail where you always felt watched, the clearings you avoided without knowing why, the dreams you dismissed as stress. I've been in your forest for so long, Connor, and you never once acknowledged me." She turned to a blank page and pressed his hand against it, forcing his fingers to grip his pencil. Then she guided his hand, making him draw. Connor watched helplessly as his own hand sketched the deer woman's face, the impossible beauty of it, the wrongness, the terror. "There," she said when he finished. "Now you've documented me. Now you're a real scientist." The sky began to lighten. Dawn approached, turning the meadow's darkness to gray. Connor could see more clearly now. Rachel's slack face, the deer woman's perfect features, his own hand still holding the pencil. He could see the hoof prints in the soft earth around them, dozens of them, as if the entity had been pacing circles around her collection all night. Voices echoed from down trail. The SAR team, approaching rapidly. Connor tried to call out, but his voice was gone. Tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't respond. He was paralyzed, or his brain had simply forgotten how to send signals to his muscles. The deer woman heard the voices and smiled. "They're coming for you, but you won't go with them, will you, Connor? Because part of you, the part that followed me up here, knows you can't unsee this, can't unknow what you've learned. The rational world is over for you." She stood in one fluid motion, her hooves clicking on stone. "I'll be here when you come back, when the hospital releases you, when you've recovered enough that everyone believes you're functional again. I'll be here in the forest waiting. Because you'll come back, Connor. They always come back." Then she was gone. Not running, not hiding, just absent, as if reality had briefly included her, and then changed its mind. The SAR team found them 20 minutes later. Connor Hayes and Rachel Whitmore, sitting side by side against a subalpine fir in a meadow at mile 14.8, both alive, both uninjured, both completely unresponsive. The rangers tried talking to them, shaking them, shining lights in their eyes. Nothing. Two experienced hikers reduced to catatonic shells, staring at nothing in a clearing full of avalanche lilies that shouldn't have been blooming in October. They carried Connor and Rachel down the mountain on stretchers, transported them to Olympic Medical Center in Port Angeles, ran every test their equipment could manage: MRI, CT scan, blood work, neurological evaluation. Found nothing wrong. No head trauma, no toxins, no organic explanation for why two healthy adults had simply stopped. The psychiatrists called it shared psychotic disorder, folie à deux, exposure-induced temporary psychosis. They kept Connor for 2 weeks, fed him antipsychotics and anti-anxiety medications, sat him in front of therapists who nodded sympathetically while he stared at the wall and said nothing. Rachel never spoke again. They transferred her to a long-term care facility in Seattle, where she spent her days making sketching motions in the air, with hands that no longer held pencils. Her parents visited every week, watching their daughter draw invisible pictures of something their minds couldn't process. Connor was luckier. After 6 weeks, he started speaking again, started eating regularly, started showing the behaviors that convinced the medical establishment he'd recovered. They released him with a diagnosis of acute stress reaction and a prescription for medications he never filled. He returned to work 3 months later. The Park Service, understanding and bureaucratic, gave him a desk job at headquarters in Port Angeles. No more field work, no more solo patrols, nothing that would put stress on his fragile recovery. Connor accepted the reassignment without argument. He sat at his desk and filed reports and attended meetings and acted like a man who'd survived a traumatic experience and moved on. But every night he dreamed of the meadow, of the dear woman's song, of her hand on his head, drawing out something he couldn't name. He woke each morning with the certainty that part of him was still sitting against that tree, staring at nothing while an ancient thing circled him with patient hunger. On April 3rd, 2012, exactly 167 days after his rescue, Connor Hayes submitted his resignation to the Park Service. He told his supervisors he needed a fresh start, was moving to Portland to be near family. They believed him because they wanted to, because the alternative was acknowledging that some people never really come back from the forest. Connor drove east out of Port Angeles, telling himself he was heading to Portland. But when he reached the junction with Highway 101, he turned north instead. Turned toward the Hoh Rainforest Visitor Center, toward the trailhead where this had all started. He parked in the empty lot at 2 a.m. The visitor center was dark, locked, lifeless. Connor sat in his car and stared at the trail entrance, feeling the pull of it like a physical force. The rational part of his brain, the part that still functioned, screamed that he was insane, that he should drive away, that returning to the forest was exactly what the dear woman had predicted. But the older part of him, the part that had followed hoofprints up a mountain in the dark, knew the truth. He'd never left. His body had been rescued and treated and released, but his mind remained in that meadow, trapped in the moment when his scientific worldview collapsed and something older and hungrier took its place. Connor got out of his car, shouldered a day pack containing water and his field notebook, the one with the drawing he'd made, the one he looked at every night. Started up the trail in darkness, following a path he'd walked 100 times before this all began. The forest welcomed him home. The moss-draped trees loomed overhead, familiar and alien. The Hoh River churned alongside the trail with its grinding whisper. And somewhere ahead, in a meadow that shouldn't exist in any rational geography, something with hooves and empty eyes waited with endless patience. Connor walked mile after mile, his headlamp beam cutting through darkness. He passed the places where he'd found Rachel's items: camera at 9.2, jacket at 10.8, backpack at 11.6, boots at 14.1. Each location felt sacred now, shrines to the process of unmaking. He walked faster, his breath coming hard, the pull growing stronger. At mile 14.8, he left the trail. The meadow appeared exactly as he remembered, avalanche lilies impossibly blooming, subalpine fir standing sentinel, starlight making everything silver. And in the center, standing among the flowers, the deer woman waited. She smiled when she saw him. "Welcome back, Connor. I knew you'd come." Connor dropped his pack and walked toward her, not fighting anymore, not trying to apply logic to something that existed outside logic. When he reached her, the deer woman took his face in her cold hands and looked into his eyes with her own beautiful, empty gaze. "You understand now," she said. "You tried to map me, catalog me, reduce me to data. But I'm not nature, Connor. I'm older than nature. I'm what lived in the gaps before your species invented explanations." She guided him to the tree where he'd sat before, where part of him had never stopped sitting. Rachel wasn't there. They'd taken her body away months ago. But Connor could see her impression in the grass, the shape of her absence. The deer woman settled beside him and began to sing. This time, Connor didn't resist. He let the song wash over him, unraveling the last threads of his rational mind. He pulled out his field notebook and began to write, documenting his final observations with the clinical precision of a scientist who'd finally found a mystery beyond ecology. Subject: unknown entity, referred to in indigenous tradition as deer woman. Observed in Olympic National Park, mile 14.8, Ho River Trail. Entity demonstrates ability to induce obsessive behavior in male subjects. Employs beauty as predatory mechanism. Hypothesis: entity feeds not on physical form but on consciousness itself, collecting human awareness the way humans collect specimens. Conclusion: some things in forests predate classification. Some hungers are older than science. Some beautiful things were never meant to be understood. The sun rose over the meadow, painting the avalanche lilies gold. Connor Hayes, former ranger, former scientist, sat against a subalpine fir and felt the last of himself slip away into dark eyes that reflected nothing. Above him, the deer woman stroked his hair with patient affection and continued her eternal song. The SAR team found his car in the visitor center parking lot 2 days later. They organized another search, another rescue. But Connor Hayes knew what Rachel had learned in her final days. That rescue was impossible. That some disappearances were permanent even when the body returned. They never found him in the meadow. The forest had swallowed him completely, adding him to its collection of beautiful mysteries that science couldn't explain. And in the years that followed, other hikers occasionally reported seeing a man on the Ho River Trail, standing among the trees, staring at nothing with eyes that looked through rather than at. The Park Service attributed these sightings to misidentification of wildlife or shadow play in the moss-filtered light. They were comfortable with rational explanations. It's what kept them sane. But the indigenous peoples who'd lived in these forests for 10,000 years before the Park Service existed knew the truth, that some things in nature aren't natural at all, that beauty can be predation, that the deer woman still walks her ancient hunting grounds patient and hungry, waiting for the next man who thinks his knowledge protects him from what lives in the spaces between science and story. Connor Hayes learned this lesson too late, but he documented it perfectly in his final field notes, the ones they found in his abandoned car, written in handwriting that deteriorated from neat scientific script to frantic scrawl. She was never the mystery. I was. We all are. Beautiful prey, walking into beautiful traps thinking our flashlights and GPS units give us dominion over forests older than our species' memory. The Ho rainforest isn't a system, it's a cathedral, and something has been worshipped here far longer than we've had words to name it. The notebook ended there mid-sentence as if Connor had been interrupted, or as if he'd finally run out of words to describe what he was seeing. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. The ice-spoken languages Sarah Blackwood had learned to ignore. Fractures propagating through frozen lake surfaces, the particular groan of black spruce bending under snow load, the whisper crack of hoarfrost releasing from pine needles at dawn, all the ordinary songs of a northern Minnesota winter. She'd spent 12 years learning to distinguish signal from noise in the Superior National Forest, And today, the noise was winning. Tyler Sanchez had been missing for 4 days. Sarah stood at the southern terminus of the Cruiser Lake Trail, February wind slicing through the gap between her balaclava and jacket collar. Her Garmin eTrex Vista HCX showed coordinates N47 degree 5832, W91 degree 1218, elevation 1,847 feet. The device was 3 years old, state-of-the-art for the National Park Service budget, and about as useful as a compass in a magnetic anomaly. Tyler's last known position had been somewhere along the frozen portage between Cruiser and Gaskin Lakes. But somewhere, covered roughly 4 square miles of old-growth forest and frozen water, where temperatures hadn't climbed above 15 degrees in a week. The thermal underwear beneath her uniform scratched against the scar tissue on her left shoulder blade, an old reminder that started itching whenever she spent too long in deep wilderness. Psychosomatic, her therapist in Duluth had said, the body keeping score when the mind tried to move forward. Sarah didn't tell Dr. Morrison about the dreams anymore, or about how certain wind patterns through red pine stands still sounded exactly like her brother Danny calling her name. Danny had disappeared in the Huron-Manistee National Forest in 1993. She'd been 12. He'd been 15. They never found anything except his backpack, hung from a branch 7 feet off the ground in a tree with no low limbs. The case file used words like presumed dead and animal predation, but Sarah remembered the look on the Michigan State Police detective's face when he'd tried to explain the lack of blood evidence. 15 years of silence hadn't provided answers, only better questions. Her Motorola XTS 5000 radio crackled. "Blackwood, this is base. You reading me?" "Copy, Hendricks. I'm at the trailhead. No fresh tracks. Wind's been working on the snow since last night." Sarah scanned the tree line, looking for the subtle wrongness that preceded most discoveries in search and recovery. A scrap of fabric, disturbed snow pattern, the glint of aluminum from a dropped water bottle. Nothing presented itself. "SAR team from Ely's mobilizing but won't reach your position until 1300 hours, Hendricks said. His voice carried the careful neutrality of someone delivering bad news. "State police want you to hold position until they arrive." Sarah checked her watch, or 9:47. 3 hours of standing still while Tyler Sanchez remained missing wasn't protocol she could stomach. The kid's last radio transmission kept replaying in her mind. She'd been working the Kawishiwi district office when the distress call came through 4 days ago. Tyler's voice high and tight with something beyond simple fear. "Someone's following me, but they're not. It's not right. How they move isn't right. And Jesus Christ, they're not walking there." Static had swallowed the rest. His emergency beacon had transmitted from this area for 6 hours before going silent. The Boundary Waters canoe area. Wilderness covered over 1 million acres, but Tyler had filed a route plan, Cruiser Lake to Gaskin to Tuscarora, a relatively civilized loop for midwinter camping. They'd found his Kelty pack 3 days ago on the Gaskin Lake ice, approximately 2 miles northeast of her current position. The pack still contained 3 days of freeze-dried meals, a full fuel canister for his MSR stove, and a journal whose final entry read, "Day 4, something wrong with the light here. Shadows move independently. Very hungry despite eating. Need to keep moving." The search team had noted that final line. Need to keep moving. Not need to find shelter or need to call for help. The phrasing suggested compulsion rather than strategy. Sarah made her decision in the space between heartbeats. "Copy your last base. I'm going to do a preliminary sweep of the immediate area while I wait. Standard safety protocols. Sarah." Hendricks knew her well enough to hear the lie. They'd worked together for 8 years, had seen each other through divorces and departmental politics, and the slow erosion that came from witnessing too much death in beautiful places. Don't do anything that requires paperwork. Wouldn't dream of it. She killed the transmission before he could argue. The trail disappeared into a colonnade of paper birch and balsam fir, their white bark and dark needles creating a photographed negative effect against the snow. Sarah's Vask snow bourbon boots found purchase on the packed trail, and she settled into the rhythm of winter travel. Slow, methodical, eyes constantly scanning for anomalies. Her pack contained 72 hours of emergency supplies, a medical kit rated for severe trauma, and, tucked in the bottom where regulations said it shouldn't be, her grandfather's hunting knife, 10 inches of carbon steel he'd carried through Korea, and 3 decades of Michigan winters. The knife had been in Danny's pack when they found it. How it had traveled back to her remained one of those mysteries that felt more like message than coincidence. 20 minutes into the forest, the first wrongness appeared. Tracks crossed the trail at a diagonal, coming from deep timber to the northeast and continuing toward Cruiser Lake. Sarah knelt beside them, her breath forming small clouds in the still air. The impressions were recent, made sometime in the last 12 hours based on the wind polish on the edges, and belonged to something approximately human-sized. Boot treads, but the gait was wrong. The stride length measured nearly 6 feet from heel strike to heel strike, suggesting someone with extremely long legs moving at speed. But the depth of the impressions varied wildly. Some sank 4 inches into the crust, while others barely dimpled the surface as if the thing's weight fluctuated with each step. Sarah pulled out her Canon PowerShot SD1100 and documented the tracks from 3 angles. The camera's LCD screen showed exactly what her eyes saw, which provided no comfort whatsoever. She'd seen plenty of strange tracks in her career, moose that wandered in meandering patterns suggesting brainworm infection, wolves with wounded limbs creating asymmetrical trails, even a black bear that had apparently learned to walk upright for short distances. Nature accommodated injury and aberration, but these tracks suggested something that didn't quite understand how weight and motion were supposed to function. She stood and followed the trail northeast away from the maintained route and into old growth. The forest here predated European contact, white pines rising 100 feet overhead with trunks 4 feet in diameter. The Ojibwe had lived in these territories for thousands of years before French voyageurs arrived in the 1600s, and their presence lingered in the landscape. Ancient pictographs on cliff faces, burial mounds hidden beneath centuries of humus, the remains of wild rice camps along shallow lakes. Sarah had found artifacts before, a copper spear point once, a shattered clay pot another time, and had dutifully reported them to the tribal liaison office in Grand Portage. The tracks led to a clearing where something had happened. Blood painted the snow in an arc that suggested violent motion. Not the simple scatter of a predator kill, but something more chaotic. Dark arterial spray, mixed with paler streaks that might have been tissue or viscera. The volume wasn't sufficient for a complete kill, maybe 2 pints total, Sarah estimated, but the pattern defied easy interpretation. At the center of the disturbance, something had pressed itself into the snow with enough force to compact the ice crystals into a vaguely humanoid outline. Arms spread wide, legs together, head tilted at an angle that made her neck ache in sympathy. And around this snow angel, someone had arranged bones, small ones mostly, ribs and vertebrae and what looked like metacarpals from something rabbit-sized. They formed a circle approximately 8 feet in diameter, and at the cardinal points, larger bones jutted upward, femurs maybe, or tibias. Sarah wasn't a forensic anthropologist, but she'd completed enough wildlife mortality investigations to recognize how deliberately this arrangement had been constructed. This wasn't scavenger activity or natural decay. Someone had collected these bones and placed them with intention. Her radio remained silent. The forest absorbed sound like wool absorbed water, creating a deadness in the air that made her breathing seem obscenely loud. Sarah photographed everything, moving in a careful spiral to document the scene without contaminating it further. The blood appeared relatively fresh, coagulated but not frozen solid, which placed it within the last 6 to 12 hours. Tyler had been missing for 96 hours. Either he'd survived this long and been injured recently, or something else entirely had happened here. The temperature dropped as she worked, and with it came a smell. Subtle at first, riding the edge of perception. Decay and copper and something else. Something that reminded her of the smell that had filled their Michigan home the winter Danny disappeared. Her mother had blamed it on a dead animal in the crawlspace, but they'd never found a source. The smell had simply permeated everything for 3 months before gradually fading, and Sarah still associated it with loss and unanswered questions. She was zipping her camera back into its case when the branches overhead rattled without wind. Sarah's hand moved to the bear spray on her belt, a token gesture since the temperature rendered the pressurized capsaicin nearly useless, and she scanned the canopy. Nothing visible, but the disturbance had been real. Something large moving through the crown layer, traveling with enough force to shake snow loose from branches 40 feet up. Tyler? Her voice sounded small in the vast silence. Tyler Sanchez, this is Park Service. If you can hear me, I need you to respond. The forest offered nothing except that smell growing stronger. Sarah made herself breathe normally and think through the protocols. She should radio this in. The blood and bone arrangement represented a significant scene, possibly criminal in nature. But calling it in meant waiting for state police, meant losing time, meant watching the thermal window for finding Tyler alive close, minute by minute. The kid was 23 years old, a University of Minnesota biology student who'd gotten the proper permits and filed the proper plans, and done everything right except survive contact with whatever was wrong in these woods. The tracks continued northeast from the clearing, still maintaining that impossible stride length. Sarah followed them. The forest changed character as she moved deeper into unmapped territory. The white pines gave way to black spruce and tamarack, standing so dense that her visibility dropped to 30 feet in any direction. These were the bog forests, growing in acidic soils that preserved organic material for centuries. Somewhere beneath her boots lay the accumulated plant matter of 10,000 years, compacted into peat that would eventually become coal, given enough geological time. The Ojibwe told stories about these places, about spirits that lived in the deep bogs, about the importance of never camping alone in black spruce groves, about what happened to humans who let hunger become their only thought. Wendigo. That was the Ojibwe word. Sarah had learned it during a cultural sensitivity training 3 years ago, taught by an elder from the Red Cliff Band. The training had covered sacred sites and proper protocols for handling indigenous artifacts, but it had ended with a warning. There are old things in these forests, older than the trees. They don't die, they just wait, and they know when someone is paying attention. Sarah hadn't thought about that warning in years. Now it played on repeat in her mind as she followed the tracks deeper into the bog forest, watching the light fail early the way it always did in dense timber. Her watch showed 11:23, too early for natural darkness. But the canopy filtered sunlight into a premature dusk that turned the snow gray and made distances impossible to judge. The tracks ended at a frozen creek. Not ended exactly. They walked directly onto the ice and continued toward the center, where the frozen surface showed a darkness that suggested open water beneath. Sarah approached cautiously, testing the ice with her trekking pole before committing her weight. The surface held, groaning but stable, and she moved to where the tracks terminated at a hole perhaps 3 feet in diameter. Someone had broken through here. Recently, the edges of the hole showed fresh fracture lines, and dark water welled up from below, already beginning to skim with new ice in the sub-zero temperatures. Sarah knelt at the edge and played her flashlight beam across the surface. The water was clear enough to see perhaps 4 feet down, and what she saw made her breath catch. A face looked back at her from beneath the ice. Not Tyler's face. This face belonged to something that had perhaps been human once, but time and water and other forces had rendered it into something else entirely. The skin had taken on the waxy white pallor of adipocere, grave wax, the substance that formed when bodies decomposed in cold, wet environments. The eyes were open, filmed over with cataracts or ice crystals. The mouth hung slack, revealing too many teeth arranged in rows that suggested shark more than human. And the body was moving. Not floating with current, the water here was still, but reaching upward with hands that ended in fingers too long, joints too numerous, reaching for her. Sarah scrambled backward hard enough to lose her footing, landing on her back with enough force to drive the air from her lungs. Her pack cushioned the impact, but pain shot up her spine and her vision momentarily whited out. When it cleared, she was staring up at the canopy, and something was staring back at her. It hung from a branch 20 feet overhead, body contorted in a configuration that defied skeletal possibility. Too thin, emaciated to the point where she could see individual ribs pressing against translucent skin. The head tilted at an angle that should have required a broken neck, and the eyes reflected her flashlight beam with the green eyeshine of a nocturnal predator. Then it smiled with a mouth full of those shark teeth, and Sarah understood with perfect clarity that she was looking at what Tyler Sanchez had become. The thing that had been Tyler dropped from the branch with fluid grace and landed in a crouch that brought its face within 3 feet of hers, close enough for her to smell the carrion reek of its breath, close enough to see the tatters of REI winter gear still clinging to its changed body, close enough to read the name written on the remains of its jacket in permanent marker, T. Sanchez. "Hungry," it whispered in a voice like wind through a desiccated corpse. "So hungry. Always hungry. Even when I eat. Especially when I eat. It just makes room for more hunger. Do you understand? Can you feel it too? The way your stomach is never full. How every meal is just the prelude to the next meal. The way satisfaction is a lie we tell ourselves between moments of wanting." Sarah's hand found the bear spray, but her fingers were numb, clumsy. The thing wearing Tyler's face tracked the movement with predatory focus, and its smile widened until the corners of its mouth split, dark fluid leaking down its chin. "You're like her," it said. "The one from before, the boy. I remember him. He tasted like copper and pine sap, and he fought so hard, but the hunger was already growing in him by then. He'd gone 3 days without food, you see. 3 days of rationing and trying to make his supplies last, and by the time I found him, he was already halfway transformed, already learning what it meant to be truly empty." The world contracted to a pinpoint of absolute focus. Sarah's voice emerged as a whisper. "Danny? Is that what he was called? Before?" The thing tilted its head with a crack of cartilage. "Names don't matter much after the change. We're all just vessels for the hunger then. But yes, I remember. 15 years ago. Different forest, same mistakes. He went into the woods carrying too little, expecting too much. The cold makes the hunger worse, you see. It takes so many calories to stay warm, and when those calories run out, the body starts burning itself. And when the body is burning itself, when you're so empty that your organs start consuming their own tissues, that's when we come. That's when the transformation is easiest." Sarah's radio crackled with static, Hendrick's voice barely audible through interference. "Aquid, come in. SAR team is position in minutes. Confirm." The Tyler thing's head snapped toward the sound with inhuman speed. Its pupils dilated until the entire eye appeared black and a sound emerged from its throat that was part growl, part sob. "More," it said. "More vessels. More hunger to feed the hunger. You brought them here." It moved. Sarah's training took over, bypassing conscious thought. She rolled left as those elongated fingers slashed the space where her throat had been, came up into a crouch with the bear spray deployed. The pressurized capsaicin hissed out in a stream that caught the thing across the face. In summer temperatures, it would have incapacitated a grizzly. In sub-zero weather, it crystallized in mid-air into an orange mist that accomplished nothing except announce her position. The Tyler thing laughed, a wet, burbling sound, and lunged again. Sarah threw herself toward the frozen creek, heard the ice crack beneath her weight, felt the nauseating sensation of the surface giving way. Cold water hit her like a physical blow, shocking her system into hyperventilation. She went under, her pack dragging her down, and in the murk below saw others. Bodies. Dozens of them. Suspended in the water column like grotesque ornaments, all at various stages of transformation. Some still looked mostly human. Others had progressed further, their limbs elongating, their jaws distending, their skin taking on that waxy translucence, and all of them were reaching upward, fingers grasping at the ice above, eternally hungry and eternally trapped. Sarah kicked hard, fighting her way back to the surface. Her head broke through into air and she gasped, sucking in oxygen mixed with frozen mist. The Tyler thing stood at the edge of the hole, watching her with an expression that might have been pity. "It's better to give in," it said. "Fighting just prolongs the suffering. Let yourself sink. Let the cold do its work. When you rise again, you'll understand. The hunger becomes everything, and in that everything there's a kind of peace. She scrabbled at the ice edge, trying to find purchase, but her gloves were soaked, and her fingers had already progressed beyond numbness into the leaden uselessness of advanced hypothermia. Water temperatures in the boundary waters in February hovered around 33 degrees, just above freezing. She had maybe 5 minutes before her core temperature dropped below critical thresholds, less if she couldn't get out. The thing reached down with one elongated hand, offering assistance. Sarah stared at those fingers. Too many joints, too many bones, nails that had grown into something closer to talons, and thought about Danny, about how he must have faced something similar, alone in the Michigan wilderness, 15 years old and dying by degrees, about whether he'd taken the offered hand. She grabbed her grandfather's knife from her belt instead. The blade punched into the Tyler thing's palm with a wet thunk, driving through tissue and emerging from the back of its hand. It shrieked, a sound that was equal parts pain and fury, and jerked backward. Sarah used that moment of distraction to heave herself up onto the ice, rolling away from the hole until she hit solid ground. Her clothes were already freezing, her jacket stiffening into icy armor that restricted movement. She ran. The bog forest became a blur of dark trunks and darker shadows, her feet finding purchase on autopilot while her conscious mind focused entirely on the basics. Breathe, move, survive. Behind her, the thing gave chase, and she could hear others joining it. Multiple sets of footfalls moving with that wrong gait, calling to each other in voices that might have once been human. Her radio crackled again. Wood, respond, we're visual, smoke. Smoke. The SAR team had lit a signal flare. Sarah changed direction, following the faint orange glow visible through the trees. Her lungs burned and her legs had progressed beyond pain into a distant numbness that suggested the early stages of frostbite. Wet feet in sub-zero temperatures. She had 30 minutes, maybe less. The forest opened into a clearing and she saw them. 3 figures in bright SAR gear, standing around an emergency flare that spit orange sparks into the gray air. They turned at her approach and Sarah tried to shout a warning, but her throat had frozen shut, her vocal cords locked. One of the SAR team members took a step toward her. Jesus, we've got a victim here. Get the Tyler thing hit him from behind with enough force to snap his spine. Sarah heard the crack, saw the man's expression shift from concern to incomprehension as his legs stopped responding. He collapsed, and the thing fell upon him with those shark teeth, and the sound it made while feeding would haunt her for whatever time she had remaining. The other 2 SAR members scattered, screaming into their radios, reaching for equipment that couldn't help them. One pulled a flare gun and fired, the magnesium round streaking upward to burst in a red star above the canopy. The other ran, crashing through the brush with the panic-blind momentum of prey that knows it's already dead. Sarah ran too, but her direction was different. Toward, not away. She grabbed the emergency flare from where it had fallen in the snow and held it up like a torch, the 2,000-degree flame close enough to feel its heat against her frozen skin. The Tyler thing looked up from its meal, face slick with blood, and met her eyes. Come on, she said. I know what you are. Wendigo, spirit of hunger and winter, but you're still wearing Tyler, and somewhere in there he's still screaming. So come on, let me give you what you really want. The thing rose to its full height, easily 7 feet now, the body having elongated during transformation, and its smile returned. Behind it, more shapes emerged from the forest. A woman in 1970s hiking gear, her hair frozen into white icicles. A man whose face showed clear evidence of frostbite from decades past. A child, no more than 10 years old, whose name tag from a summer camp still clung to her jacket. Madison Lakes YMCA. Danny wasn't among them, but Sarah found herself searching their faces anyway, hoping and dreading in equal measure. The Tyler thing took a step forward. You can't burn us all. No, Sarah agreed, but I can burn enough. She dropped the flare into her open pack where it landed among her emergency supplies. The magnesium flame found the fuel canister for her camp stove first, and the explosion happened faster than thought. Heat and force and light all compressed into a single instant of absolute clarity. Sarah flew backward, her pack vaporizing, the shrapnel of camping equipment turning into projectiles that shredded the approaching Wendigos. The Tyler thing's skull came apart like rotten fruit, spattering tissue and bone across the snow. The woman in 1970s gear lost an arm and kept advancing, hunger overriding any sense of self-preservation. The child thing simply evaporated, too small to withstand the blast wave. Sarah hit the ground hard enough to crack ribs and tasted blood. Her ears rang with a high-pitched whine that drowned out everything except the hammering of her own heart. She tried to stand and discovered that her left leg wouldn't cooperate, the femur probably fractured. Pain arrived in waves, each cresting higher than the last. Through the smoke and ringing, she saw the survivor, one of the SAR team members, the one who'd run. He emerged from the tree line, eyes wide, radio in hand. Behind him, more shapes moved in the gathering darkness. The explosion had killed some of the Wendigos, but hunger couldn't be destroyed so easily. It simply found new vessels. "Run!" Sarah tried to say, but blood filled her mouth. "Don't stop. Don't let them catch you. And whatever you do, don't let yourself get hungry." The man ran. She hoped he'd make it, but didn't bother calculating odds. Her vision was narrowing, tunneling down to a pinpoint that contained only the gray sky above and the dark trees swaying at its edges. Cold seeped into her bones, a different cold than the ambient temperature, the final cold that came when the body gave up maintaining its core. Something moved in her peripheral vision, a shape resolving out of the smoke and shadows. Sarah tried to track it, but her eyes wouldn't cooperate, wouldn't focus. It knelt beside her, and she smelled pine sap and copper, exactly the way Danny had smelled when they were children, and he'd come home from the woods with scraped knees and ambitious stories. "Sarah?" His voice unchanged by 15 years or transformation or death. "You shouldn't have come looking. Some things, when they're lost, they're supposed to stay lost." She tried to speak but managed only a wet cough that sprayed blood across the snow. Danny, or the thing that wore his shape, reached out with fingers that had too many joints and brushed hair back from her forehead in a gesture she remembered from childhood. "I tried to fight it," he said. "For so long I tried. But the hunger wins eventually. It always wins. And when it does, you forget what it was like to be full, to be satisfied, to want anything except more. I'm sorry I couldn't wait for you. I'm sorry I took others. But the hunger, Sarah, you can't understand the hunger until it has you." Her vision continued to narrow. The radio crackled somewhere nearby, Hendricks' frantic voice calling her name, demanding response, begging for confirmation. Sarah wanted to answer, but her throat had filled with fluid, and the cold had progressed too far. Danny leaned closer, his breath visible in the frozen air. "I can make it stop hurting. I can make it all stop. Would you like that? Would you like me to end it now, quick, before the transformation starts? Because you're dying already, and when you die out here, in the cold, with the hunger growing in your belly, you'll become like us. Another vessel, another ghost in the forest. I could spare you that." Sarah met his eyes, still brown, still her brother's eyes, despite everything else that had changed, and made her choice. She shook her head, the movement tiny but unmistakable. "Okay," Danny said softly. "Okay, then I'll see you soon, little sister. When you rise again, I'll teach you how to hunt, how to find the ones who come into the forest unprepared, how to spot the hunger in them before they even know it themselves. We'll be together again. Isn't that what you always wanted?" He stood and melted back into the forest, taking his impossible shape with him. Sarah lay in the snow and watched the sky darken from gray to charcoal to black. Her breathing slowed. Her heart forgot its rhythm, stumbled, caught itself, stumbled again. The cold stopped feeling like cold and started feeling like nothing at all. Her radio crackled one final time. "All units, we have multiple casualties at the Cruiser Lake site. I repeat, multiple casualties. Blackwood is down, Alvarez is down, Chen is missing. We need immediate medical evac and... Jesus Christ, what is that? What the fuck is that? It's moving wrong, it's..." Static swallowed Hendricks' scream. They found Sarah Blackwood 3 days later, hypothermic but alive, curled in a snow cave 2 miles from the explosion site. She couldn't, or wouldn't, explain how she'd traveled that distance with a fractured femur and stage 3 frostbite. She couldn't explain the wounds on her hands that looked like bites or why her pack was empty, despite no evidence of the explosion she described. The blood in the clearing, the bones arranged in circles, Tyler Sanchez's remains, none of it could be located. The search area yielded nothing except trees and snow and the usual silence of deep winter. Sarah resigned from the National Park Service on March 15, 2008. She moved back to Michigan, to a small town far from any national forest, and took a job teaching middle school science. She attended therapy twice a week for 3 years, took medications that made her dreams less vivid, and learned to sleep with all the lights on. She kept a food journal, documenting every meal, every calorie, making sure she was never, ever hungry. Because the hunger was the door, and if she let it open even slightly, she knew what would be waiting on the other side. Sometimes, in the deep of winter, she still smelled pine sap and copper. Sometimes she heard her brother's voice calling her name from forests she'd never entered. And sometimes, rarely but often enough to matter, she caught herself in the mirror and thought her reflection's eyes looked a little too green. Her smile showed a few too many teeth. Her fingers seemed to have an extra joint she couldn't quite account for. The Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness remains one of the most popular destinations for winter camping in North America. Every year, dozens of people enter its million acres seeking solitude and natural beauty. Most of them return, but if you venture into those northern forests during the coldest months, remember to bring enough food. More than you think you'll need. Twice that amount, actually. Because the hunger that lives in those woods, the hunger that predates human settlement and will outlast human memory, it knows exactly when you're running low. It can smell the moment your body starts consuming itself for fuel. And once it smells that, once it knows you're ready, it will find you. It will show you its 1,000 faces, all of them wearing someone who came before you, all of them smiling with too many teeth. It will offer to end your suffering or extend it, to make you whole or make you empty, to kill you quickly or transform you slowly. The choice, as always, will be yours. But here's the thing about choices made in extremity, in the deep cold and deeper hunger. They stop feeling like choices eventually. They start feeling like inevitability, like surrender, like the only possible option in a world that's narrowed to a single imperative: feed. And once you've fed, once you've learned that satisfaction is just another form of hunger, you'll understand what Tyler Sanchez discovered in his final moments. You'll understand what Danny Blackwood learned over 15 years of eternal appetite. You'll understand what Sarah Blackwood fights against every single day, knowing that the fight itself is just another kind of starvation. The Wendigo doesn't just consume people. It consumes the space between satisfied and hungry, collapsing that boundary until they become the same state. And once that boundary collapses, once you can no longer tell the difference between feast and famine, you've already transformed. You just haven't noticed yet. Sarah Blackwood noticed. She notices every day, and she'll keep noticing until the day she stops fighting, or the day the hunger finally wins. In the Boundary Waters, winter remains long and silent and absolute. The lakes freeze solid, the forests stand patient, and in the darkest places, in the bog forests where black spruce grows dense enough to strangle light, something waits with infinite patience and eternal appetite. It knows your name before you speak it. It knew you were coming before you packed your first bag, and it will still be waiting long after you've forgotten what it feels like to be full. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. Thomas Brennan had learned to measure time by the weight of fog. 7 years as a ranger at Olympic National Park had taught him that mornings in the Hoh rainforest arrive not with light, but with gradations of gray. Charcoal giving way to pewter, giving way to something almost resembling daylight if you squinted hard enough and lied to yourself. He stood on the porch of the Soldick Ranger Station at 6:47 a.m., holding his third cup of coffee and watching the mist move through the Sitka spruce like something breathing. The coffee tasted like rust. Everything tasted like rust lately, ever since he'd started the new prescription Dr. Vance had given him for the nightmares. Sertraline 100 milliliters. Take one daily with food. The bottle sat in his truck's glove compartment next to his old Motorola MTS 2000 radio and a St. Christopher medal that had belonged to his father. Tom hadn't decided yet whether the medal was comfort or accusation. His Garmin GPS unit chirped from inside, the morning weather update downloading via satellite. Clear skies predicted for the Olympic Peninsula, which meant absolutely nothing here under the primordial canopy where some trees had been growing since before Columbus sailed. The rainforest created its own climate, its own rules. Tom had stopped trusting predictions of any kind after 2007. He was thinking about Michael Reeves again. He thought about Michael Reeves every morning, but especially on mornings like this when the fog moved wrong, when it seemed to gather in shapes that almost resembled human silhouettes before dissipating into ordinary vapor. Michael Reeves, 23 years old, Eagle Scout, experienced hiker, vanished from the Sol Duke Falls Trail on October 14, 2007, during Tom's second year as a ranger. They'd found his backpack 3 days later, contents neatly arranged on a fallen log 2 miles off trail. His journal opened to a page that read only, "They're not shadows, they're holes." The official report called it acute psychosis, brought on by hypothermia. Tom had written that report himself, had signed his name to it, had filed it away in a gray cabinet where it lived with all the other explanations for things that resisted explanation. His phone buzzed. Text from Jennifer, the station's daytime dispatcher. Missing hiker reported. 28-year female. Last contact yesterday, 4 p.m. Sol Duke Falls Trail. Park Service mobilizing. Tom's hands went cold despite the coffee. Sol Duke Falls Trail. The same trail. He was inside and pulling on his uniform jacket before he'd consciously decided to move. His body operating on 7 years of training while his mind tried to push against the familiar weight settling behind his sternum. Jennifer was already at her station when he entered, her fingers flying across the keyboard, pulling up the missing person report on the dual monitor setup. "Sophia Chen," Jennifer said without looking up. 28 solo hiker. Checked in at the trailhead yesterday at 11:30 a.m. Was supposed to meet friends in Port Angeles for dinner at 6. Never showed. Phone going straight to voicemail. Friends filed the report at midnight after calling every hospital between here and Seattle. Tom studied the photograph on the screen. Sophia Chen had black hair pulled into a practical ponytail, intelligent eyes behind wireframe glasses, and a smile that suggested she was the kind of person who read the preparedness guidelines and actually followed them. She wore a North Face jacket in the photo, forest green, and Tom found himself noting the color with the detached precision of someone cataloging evidence. "Experience level?" he asked. "Moderate. Friends say she hikes regularly, knows basic backcountry protocol, always carries the 10 essentials. Left her itinerary with them, planned to do the full loop, approximately 8 miles. Should have taken her 5 hours maximum." 5 hours. It had been 15 hours now, in October, with temperatures dropping into the low 40s at night. "Who's lead on the SAR?" Tom heard himself ask, though he already knew the answer. There were only 3 rangers qualified for search and rescue operations in this sector, and the other 2 were handling a rescue operation near Hurricane Ridge. Jennifer finally looked up at him, and Tom saw the apology in her eyes before she spoke. "That would be you, Tom. I'm sorry. I know the trail." "It's fine," he said, which was a lie so transparent that Jennifer's expression didn't change. "I'll gear up. Contact the volunteer SAR team. Get a dog handler if we can. I want boots on the ground in 45 minutes. He was back in his truck before his hands started shaking. The St. Christopher medal caught the weak morning light, and Tom wrapped his fingers around it hard enough that the metal edges bit into his palm. The pain helped. It always helped, that sharp little reminder that he was here now, in 2014, not in 2007, not standing at the edge of Lost Creek calling Michael's name until his voice gave out. The drive to the Sol Duke Falls trailhead took 23 minutes through forest, so dense that his headlights seemed to be swallowed rather than reflected. Tom counted trees. It was a trick Dr. Vance had taught him. When the thoughts started spiraling, anchor yourself in physical reality. Count something, breathe. Remember that you survived and that survival meant you got to keep trying. 147 trees by his count. though several merged together in the fog and he might have counted them twice. The trailhead parking lot held 5 vehicles. Tom recorded their makes, models, and license plates in his notebook, photographed each with his department-issue Canon, and marked their positions on his map. Sophia's car was the blue Honda Civic, Washington plates, a university parking permit still stuck to the windshield. Tom cupped his hands against the driver's window and looked inside. Clean interior. A CD case on the passenger seat. The National, a band Tom didn't recognize. A pair of running shoes in the back. Nothing that suggested distress or hurried departure. He was circling the vehicle for the 3rd time when he noticed them. The shadows under the car were wrong. Tom crouched down, his knees protesting. The morning light was growing stronger now, the sun climbing somewhere above the canopy, and the shadows beneath the Civic should have been receding, growing shorter and more defined. Instead, they seemed to be pooling, gathering with a density that reminded Tom of motor oil spreading across concrete. He pulled his mag light from his belt and shone it underneath the chassis. The shadow didn't react to the light. It stayed exactly as it was, dark and viscous and somehow deeper than the 6-inch clearance between car and asphalt should have allowed. Tom stood up fast enough that his vision sparked with white dots. He blinked them away and looked again. Normal shadow. Just a normal shadow cast by a normal car in normal morning light. He checked the time on his GPS unit, 7:52 a.m. The SAR team would be here in minutes. He needed to be professional, focused, present. He needed to not see things that weren't there. The trailhead marker showed 2.3 miles to Solduke Falls. Elevation gain of 350 feet. Estimated time 2 hours round trip. Tom had hiked it 300 times, could walk it blindfolded, knew every route and rock and switchback. The trail began as a well-maintained gravel path before transitioning to packed earth, winding through a cathedral of Douglas fir and western hemlock that filtered the light into aquarium dimness. Moss grew on everything, great swaths of it hanging from branches like tattered curtains, carpeting every surface in velvet inches thick. The rainforest consumed sound, absorbed it, so that even Tom's footsteps seemed muffled and distant. He made it 40 yards before he had to stop and press his palm against a tree trunk, breathing deliberately through his nose. The bark was rough under his hand, textured with lichen and damp with moisture. Real, solid. He counted his breaths. 1, 2, 3, 4. They're not shadows, they're holes. Shut up, Tom whispered to the empty trail. Shut up, Michael. 3 vehicles pulled into the parking lot behind him, the volunteer SAR team arriving in a cluster. Tom recognized them before they'd even climbed out. Rick Matheson, retired firefighter, 61 years old and built like a fire hydrant. Paula Chen, no relation to Sophia, but Tom's mind noted the shared surname anyway. Emergency room nurse and the best tracker Tom had ever worked with. And bringing up the rear, Doug Martinez with his German Shepherd Sadie, the only certified search dog in Jefferson County. Tom briefed them in 90 seconds, his voice steady and professional, ranger speak coming automatically. Last known position, estimated trajectory, timeline, weather conditions, search pattern Alpha 3, which meant they'd split into pairs and work a grid extending from the established trail. Rick would take the northern quadrant with Paula. Tom would handle the primary trail with Doug and Sadie, since the dog needed to start where Sophia had definitely been. One more thing, Paula said, her dark eyes sharp in the morning light. She'd been doing SAR work for 12 years, had found 7 lost hikers and recovered the remains of 3 who'd waited too long for rescue. I pulled the incident reports for this trail going back 20 years. 4 missing persons cases, all unsolved. 1999, 2003, 2007, and now. Different seasons, different demographics, but same trail sector. Tom's chest constricted. 4. Paula had said 4. I don't remember a case in 1999, he managed. Before your time. Amanda Vickers, age 36, vanished during a full moon in October. They found her camera 3 weeks later. Last photo on the memory card was of the trail ahead, normal daytime shot. The photo before that was also of the trail. Same exact shot, same lighting, same angle, same composition. Timestamps showed they were taken 4 hours apart. Rick whistled low. Equipment malfunction? That's what the report said. Paula's tone suggested she had opinions about what reports said. The 2003 case was similar. Kevin Brennan. She paused, glanced at Tom. Any relation? The Forrest tilted. Tom gripped his radio to keep from dropping it. My brother. My older brother, Kevin. He disappeared hiking out here in August 2003. I was still in college. They told us he fell, that he'd gone off trail, and he couldn't finish. The words tangled in his throat like moss, choking him. Paula's expression softened with something that might have been pity, or might have been understanding. I'm sorry, Tom. I didn't realize. The report said probable accidental death by falling. Body never recovered. But there were some odd notes in the file. Witness reported seeing him walking in circles near mile marker 3, talking to himself. Another hiker said he looked wrong, like he was moving through water. Tom remembered the funeral with no casket. Remembered his mother's face, gray and crumpled. Remembered choosing the Rangers afterward, choosing this park, choosing to spend 7 years walking the same trails where Kevin had vanished because he'd believed, he still believed, that understanding the forest meant understanding what had happened. Except now there were 4 cases, 4 people gone from the same trail, and Tom had known about 2 of them, had been part of one of them, and somehow he'd never connected the pattern, never seen the shape emerging from the data. Or maybe he had seen it and had chosen not to look. Sadie whined, a high, anxious sound that pulled Tom back to the present. The dog was staring at the trailhead, her ears flat against her skull, her body tense with focused alertness that had nothing to do with eagerness. Doug frowned and shortened the leash. She's acting hinky, he muttered. Never seen her like this at a start point. Tom made himself move. Let's go. Sophia Chen has been out here for 15 hours. Every minute we waste is a minute she doesn't have. They moved into the forest in a line, Tom taking point with his GPS unit tracking their coordinates, Paula and Rick branching north after the first quarter mile, Doug and Sadie staying on Tom's 6. The trail descended gradually, following the Sol Duke River's contour, the sound of water growing from whisper to murmur to low thunder as they approached the falls. Mushrooms clustered at the base of trees, witch's butter, turkey tail, artist's conch, and banana slugs left silver trails across the path like breadcrumbs leading nowhere. Mile marker 1 came and went. Then mile marker 2, Sadie pulled toward every scent cone, investigating decomposing logs and nurse stumps with professional thoroughness. But she didn't alert. No indication that Sophia had deviated from the main trail. Tom's radio crackled periodically with updates from Rick and Paula. Negative contact, continuing sweep, moving to grid sector B2. At mile marker 2.8, Sadie stopped walking. The shepherd planted her feet and refused to move forward, her whole body rigid, a low growl building in her chest that Tom felt more than heard. Doug tried coaxing her, then commanding her, then offering treats from the pouch on his belt. Sadie ignored all of it, her attention fixed on the trail ahead where it curved around a massive cedar tree whose trunk was easily 15 feet in diameter. Tom, Doug said quietly, something's wrong. She's trained to push through discomfort, to work past distractions. I've never seen her refuse to advance. Tom studied the trail ahead. It looked identical to the trail behind them. Packed earth, fallen needles, the endless canopy filtering light into submarine dimness. But there was something about the quality of the shadows beyond that cedar tree, something about the way they seemed to pool rather than stretch, to gather in configurations that his eyes kept sliding away from. He pulled his mag light and shone it ahead. The beam penetrated maybe 15 feet before seeming to weaken, to diffuse as though the air itself had grown thicker. Stay here with Sadie, Tom heard himself say. I'm going to advance and assess. Tom, if the dog won't go... I said stay here, that's an order. He moved forward before Doug could argue, before his own better judgment could stop him, his hand resting on his radio but not keying it, because what would he say? That he was afraid of shadows? That a German shepherd's reluctance was enough to abort a search when a woman's life hung in the balance? The trail beyond the cedar tree felt different. The temperature dropped. Tom's breath suddenly visible in small clouds, and the ambient sound changed, grew muted, as though someone had stuffed cotton in his ears. His footsteps made no noise at all. Even the river seemed distant now, its thunder reduced to a whisper that might have been wind or might have been voices speaking just below the threshold of comprehension. Tom counted his steps. 23, 38, 51. At step 64, he found Sophia Chen's backpack. It sat in the middle of the trail, positioned with geometric precision exactly at the path's center. The straps extended to full length and arranged in parallel lines. Tom approached slowly, documenting everything with his camera before touching anything. The pack was a Gregory Diva 60, forest green, identical to the one in Sophia's photo. He pulled on latex gloves and carefully opened the main compartment. Everything was there: tent, sleeping bag, cook stove, first aid kit, water filter, emergency bivvy, the 10 essentials, all present and accounted for. Her phone was in the top pocket, a Samsung Galaxy with a cracked screen protector. Tom pressed the power button. Dead battery. But that wasn't what made his hands start shaking. It was the contents of the small notebook tucked into the front pocket, the one Sophia had apparently been using as a trail journal. Tom opened it to the last entry dated yesterday, October 13th, 2014, time-stamped 3:47 p.m. Something's following me. I can't see it directly, but I can see where it isn't. Does that make sense? Like empty spaces shaped like people. They're in my peripheral vision, moving between trees. Every time I turn my head, they're gone, but I can feel them watching. The shadows here are wrong. Too dark, too deep. Like they go down and there's no bottom. I should turn back. I know I should turn back. But my feet keep moving forward, and I don't think I'm controlling them anymore. If someone finds this, tell my parents I tried. Tell them The entry ended mid-sentence, the pen trailing off into a long scratch across the page. Tom's radio crackled. Rick's voice tense. Tom, you need to see this. Grid sector B4, approximately 300 yards northwest of trail marker 3. You need to see this right now. Tom marked the GPS coordinates of the backpack, photographed everything from 6 angles, and made himself leave it where it lay. Potential evidence, chain of custody, proper protocol. His legs felt disconnected from his body as he moved through the forest toward Rick's coordinates, pushing through sword ferns and salal, his compass needle spinning lazily as though magnetic north had become a suggestion rather than a fact. He found Rick and Paula standing in a clearing he didn't recognize, though he'd covered this sector 100 times. They weren't speaking. They were just standing there, staring at the ground, their faces bleached of color. Tom pushed past them and looked down. 7 trees formed a perfect circle in the clearing, their trunks massive and ancient, their roots interlocking beneath a carpet of moss. And in the exact center of that circle, scratched into the earth as though with desperate fingers, was a message. Thomas Brennan, 2007. Kevin Brennan, 2003. Amanda Vickers, 1999. Sophia Chen, 2014. 4 names, 4 dates, scratched into dirt that should have been covered by years of decomposition and growth, but instead looked fresh, raw, as though carved yesterday or 5 minutes ago, or in some impossible time that existed sideways to normal causality. And beneath the names, in letters 3 feet tall, they take the ones who look for the lost. Paula's voice came from very far away. Tom, we need to radio this in. We need to... Tom, are you okay? He wasn't okay. He was standing in a clearing he'd never found before, looking at his own name next to his dead brother's name, next to Michael Reeves's name. Except no, Michael's name wasn't there. Michael wasn't listed, which meant, we need to leave, Tom said. His voice sounded wrong, hollow, like sound traveling through a tunnel. We need to leave right now. Rick was pulling his radio, calling for extraction, his words professional and clipped. Station, this is SR Team 1. We have a situation requiring immediate law enforcement response, requesting sheriff and forensics team. The radio shrieked feedback so loud that Rick dropped it. The device hit the ground and went silent. its LED display flickering through random numbers before dying completely. Paula tried her radio. Dead. Tom tried his. Dead. In the sudden quiet, Tom heard it. Footsteps. Multiple sets of footsteps, approaching from every direction, moving through the undergrowth with perfect synchronization. But there was no sound of branches breaking, no rustle of disturbed foliage. Just footsteps, just the sound of weight pressing down on earth and moss and fallen needles. "Behind you," Paula whispered. "Tom, don't move. Whatever you do, don't turn around." But Tom was already turning because he'd spent 7 years telling himself that Michael Reeves had died from hypothermia and acute psychosis. And if he could lie to himself about that, then he could lie to himself about anything. Could let the lies build up like sediment until he'd buried himself alive in them. So he turned around and he looked. The shadows stood at the clearing's edge, and they weren't shadows at all. They were absences. Holes, gaps in the visible spectrum shaped exactly like people but containing nothing. Not darkness, not blackness, just a complete absence of anything that could be measured or perceived. Tom's eyes kept trying to focus on them and sliding away, kept trying to assign properties to things that had no properties, existed outside the framework that made existence comprehensible. There were 7 of them, 1 for each tree in the circle, and they were watching him with attention that had no eyes, regarding him with focus that had no source. And Tom understood in that moment that they'd always been watching, that the forest had been full of these watching absences for years, for decades, for centuries, and every person who'd vanished from these trails had spent their last conscious moments staring into these impossible voids. One of the absences moved forward. It had no face, but Tom knew it was looking at him specifically, knew it with the certainty of prey recognizing predator. And as it approached, Tom saw that it was carrying something, holding it in appendages that weren't hands, but functioned as hands, and that something was a backpack. Michael Reeves's backpack. "They keep them," Tom heard himself say. "They keep the ones they take. They keep their things. They keep..." The absence opened Michael's backpack and pulled out the journal, held it up for Tom to see, opened it to that final page. "They're not shadows, they're holes." And then it opened its not mouth, and Michael Reeves's voice came out of that absence. Michael's voice exactly as Tom remembered it, young and frightened and 17 years too late. "Tom, you need to run. They've been waiting for you. They always wait for someone who comes looking. That's the rule. That's how they..." The voice cut off. The absence snapped the journal shut and tucked it back into the backpack with movements that were almost tender, almost careful, and Tom realized it was showing him. They were all showing him. This was the collection. These were the things they kept, the artifacts they'd preserved from every person who'd vanished while searching for someone else. Paula grabbed his arm. "Move. Tom, we have to move now." They ran. Tom didn't remember making the decision to run. Didn't remember his legs starting to move, but suddenly he was crashing through ferns and hurdling logs, and his lungs were burning, and Rick was ahead of him. And Paula was beside him, and the forest was tilting, rotating, as though the earth itself had decided that normal geography no longer applied. They burst onto the main trail. Except it wasn't the main trail, it was a trail that looked similar, but all the landmarks were wrong. The trees too young or too old or arranged in configurations that shouldn't exist. Tom's GPS unit showed their coordinates as impossibly far north, then impossibly far south, then displayed coordinates that didn't correspond to any location on Earth. "Where's the parking lot?" Rick gasped. "Which direction is the parking lot?" Tom didn't know. He'd hiked these trails for 7 years, and he didn't know which direction led to safety because there might not be a direction anymore, might not be a parking lot, might not be anything except forest extending forever in all directions, with holes shaped like people waiting between every tree. They ran for an hour, 2 hours. Time stopped meaning anything. The sun should have been climbing toward noon, but the light stayed the same. That submarine dimness that could have been dawn or dusk or some eternal moment between states. Tom's legs were numb, and his chest felt like it was full of broken glass, and he couldn't remember why they were running except that stopping meant seeing. And seeing meant understanding. And understanding meant accepting that he'd spent 7 years living next to something vast and patient and utterly indifferent to human frameworks of reality. Paula went down first. One moment she was running beside Tom. The next she was sprawled across the trail. Her ankle twisted at an impossible angle. She didn't scream. She just looked up at Tom with absolute clarity and said, "Go, don't stop, don't look back." But Tom did stop, was already dropping to his knees beside her, was already pulling his first aid kit from his belt even though he knew it was too late, could feel the temperature plummeting, could see the shadows pooling around Paula's fallen form. "Tom." Paula gripped his wrist hard enough to hurt. "Listen to me. Kevin left you something. In his locker at the ranger station, locker 47. The combination is your birthday. He left you." One of the absences stepped out of the space between trees and bent over Paula. It moved like water, like smoke, like nothing that had bones or joints or physical structure. It touched her shoulder with an appendage that wasn't an appendage, and Paula's eyes went distant, glazed, her grip on Tom's wrist loosening. "No," Tom said. He was pulling his flashlight, shining it at the absence, knowing it wouldn't work but doing it anyway because humans shine lights at darkness, even when darkness is something that exists outside the spectrum lights can affect. "No, take me instead. The pattern. My name's in the pattern. Take me. Let her." "The pattern's already broken," Paula whispered. Her voice sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "Your brother figured it out. Every 14 years, full moon in October. 4 people, but only 3 get taken. 1 has to stay, 1 has to remember, 1 has to..." She stopped talking. Her eyes focused on something over Tom's shoulder, something behind him, and her expression shifted into pure terror. Tom turned around. There were hundreds of them now. Absences filling the forest, standing between every tree, watching with no eyes, waiting with no patience, existing in spaces where existence became negotiable, and at the front of that impossible congregation stood one absence that was different from the others, taller, more defined, almost solid. It held out Kevin's ranger jacket. Tom recognized the patches, the name tag, the coffee stain on the left sleeve from the morning of August 12, 2003. The absence put on the jacket. The fabric draped over nothing, hung on a framework that had no mass, but it was Kevin's jacket, and somehow that made the thing wearing it more terrible than anything Tom had witnessed because it was wrong, fundamentally wrong, a violation of categories that made reality navigable. And then it spoke in Kevin's voice. "Tommy, little brother, you were supposed to stay away. That was the point. That was why I left you the warning." "You didn't leave me anything," Tom said. His voice cracked. "You disappeared. They said you fell. They said..." "Locker 47, Kevin's voice said. "I left it all there. The research, the pattern. 14 years, Tommy. 1985, 1999, 2013. They hunt on the full moon in October. They take the ones who look for the lost because that's the price. That's always been the price. Native tribes knew it. Called them the Watchers in the moss. Said you had to let the forest keep what it took. Said looking for the vanished only made you vanish too." The absence wearing Kevin's jacket moved closer. Tom could smell cedar now, rich and overwhelming, strong enough to make his eyes water. Behind him, Paula had gone silent. Rick had disappeared. Tom couldn't remember when, couldn't remember the last time he'd heard the older man's voice. "I tried to break the pattern," Kevin's voice continued. "Tried to be the fourth, tried to let them take me so the cycle would end. But there always has to be one who stays, one who remembers, one who warns. That was supposed to be you, Tommy. You were supposed to read what I left you. You were supposed to stay away." "I didn't know," Tom whispered. "I didn't know any of this. I just wanted to understand what happened to you. And now you do." The absence tilted its knot head. "Now you understand. So run, little brother. Run before the moon rises. Run and don't come back. Don't look for Sophia Chen. Don't look for anyone. Let the forest keep what it's taken." "I can't," Tom said. I can't just... She's 28 years old, she has parents, she has a life, I can't just abandon... Then you'll join her. Kevin's voice held no emotion, no warmth, just flat statement of fact. They're patient, Tommy. They've waited 14 years for the next cycle. They'll wait 14 more. But if you're still here when the full moon rises, if you're still in their forest, then the pattern completes. 4 taken, none left to warn. And in 2028, they'll hunt again. The absences were moving now, flowing through the forest like water running downhill. And Tom was running again, though he couldn't feel his legs. Couldn't feel anything except the weight in his chest, and the knowledge that he was making a choice. Had been making this choice ever since he'd pinned on his ranger badge and promised to protect these woods and everyone who entered them. He ran toward where the absences were thickest, toward the direction they seemed to be guarding, because if there was something they didn't want him to reach, then that was exactly where Sophia Chen must be. The forest fought him. Roots grabbed at his ankles. Branches lashed his face. The ground tilted and shifted like the deck of a ship in a storm. Tom's GPS was showing impossible coordinates, his compass spinning freely, all his instruments reduced to useless artifacts of a geometry that had stopped applying. He navigated by instinct and desperation, pushing toward the coldest part of the forest, the darkest part, the place where the absences clustered so thickly that the spaces between trees had become solid walls of void. And then he saw her. Sophia Chen stood in a clearing identical to the one where Tom had found the names, except this clearing held no trees, no moss, no vegetation of any kind. Just bare earth and Sophia standing at the center with her eyes closed and her arms held out from her sides, as though balancing on a tightrope that existed in dimensions Tom couldn't perceive. Sophia! Tom crashed into the clearing, grabbed her shoulders, shook her. Sophia, we need to go, right now. We need to... Her eyes opened. They were completely black, no whites, no iris, just solid darkness that reflected nothing. And when she spoke, her voice held harmonics that human vocal cords couldn't produce. She's not here anymore, Thomas Brennan. She walked too far into the spaces between. But she left you a message. She asked us to tell you something before you joined the pattern. What message? Tom's hands were shaking, his whole body shaking. What did she say? Sophia's body, Sophia's stolen body, smiled with too many teeth. She said, "They're not taking us. We're transforming. We're becoming the forest's memory. And your brother says hello." The absences closed in from every direction, and Tom finally understood what they were. Not monsters, not predators, not even malevolent forces. They were the forest's immune system. They were what happened when consciousness got too tangled in the woods, when people walked too deep and stayed too long, and their patterns of thought began resonating with the ancient rhythms of moss and mycelium and centuries-old cedars. They were the price of looking, the cost of searching, the inevitable result of human awareness colliding with a place that had existed long before humans and would exist long after. And Tom had spent 7 years walking these trails. Had spent 7 years thinking about Kevin and Michael and all the others. Had spent 7 years soaking himself in the forest's patterns, until he couldn't tell where his thoughts ended, and the woods began. He felt it starting. The dissolving. His edges growing fuzzy, uncertain. His sense of being a discrete entity beginning to diffuse like ink in water. It didn't hurt. That was the worst part. It felt like coming home, like letting go of a burden he'd carried so long he'd forgotten it was a burden. "No," he said, but his voice was already growing distant. "No, I need to remember. Someone has to remember. Someone has to warn. Rick will remember," Sophia's body said. And Tom realized with distant horror that Rick Matheson had made it out, had run in the right direction, had probably already reached the parking lot and was calling for help that would arrive far too late. Rick will remember that you vanished searching for the lost. He'll remember the pattern. And in 14 years, when the moon is full in October, he'll remember to warn whoever comes looking. Tom's last conscious thought as his sense of self dissolved into the forest's vast, patient intelligence was that Dr. Vance had been wrong about the medication. It hadn't stopped the nightmares. It had just made him forget, for a little while, that he'd been living inside the nightmare all along. Rick Matheson filed his report at 11:47 p.m. on October 13, 2014, 17 hours after the search had begun. The report stated that Ranger Thomas Brennan had disappeared while searching for missing hiker Sophia Chen. Both were presumed dead due to exposure and/or accidental fall. Their bodies were never recovered. The report also noted in a single footnote that Rick fought to include over his supervisor's objections that the Sol Duke Falls Trail should be closed during October full moons, and that anyone searching for missing persons in Olympic National Park should be advised that some people, once lost, should stay lost. Rick quit the search and rescue team 3 days later. He moved to Portland, changed careers, started drinking more than he should. But every October when the moon grew full, he drove back to Olympic National Park and stood at the Sol Duke Falls trailhead with a can of spray paint. On the trail marker at mile 0, he added new names to a growing list. Don't look for the lost, they're not lost anymore. And sometimes, on nights when the fog moved through the parking lot with too much purpose, Rick thought he could see them standing at the forest's edge. Thomas Brennan, Sophia Chen, Michael Reeves, Kevin Brennan, Amanda Vickers, and others stretching back decades, maybe centuries. They weren't shadows, they were holes. And they were watching the trailhead with patient attention, waiting for the next person who loved someone enough to come searching, waiting for the next consciousness ready to dissolve into the forest's endless, hungry memory. The ranger station cleaned out Tom's locker 3 weeks later. They found his extra uniforms, his emergency supplies, his personal effects. They found the St. Christopher medal, which they sent to Tom's mother, though she never opened the package. They also found locker 47, which had belonged to Kevin Brennan. The combination was Thomas Brennan's birthday, Oro 1573. Inside was a single notebook, its pages filled with Kevin's handwriting, dated July through August 2003. The notebook documented 14 years of disappearances, patterns in the vanishings, interviews with Native American elders about the watchers in the moss, research into consciousness and ecology, and the ways that awareness might function as an invasive species in ecosystems evolved to operate without it. The last entry, dated August 11, 2003, the day before Kevin disappeared, read, "If you're reading this, Tommy, then I failed. I tried to be the fourth, tried to close the cycle, but the pattern has rules, and the rules are absolute. 4 must enter, 3 must join, 1 must remember and warn. Don't come looking for me. Don't try to understand. Some things in this world exist outside human frameworks, and approaching them changes you into something that can interface with them, and that change is permanent. I love you, little brother. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you from this knowledge. All I can do now is ask you to break the chain. Don't become a ranger. Don't work in this park. Don't walk these trails. Let the forest keep what it's taken, including me, and live your life somewhere the shadows are just shadows. But I know you, Tommy. I know you won't listen. You'll want to understand. You'll want to save people. And that wanting will pull you into the pattern just like it pulled me. So when you vanish, and you will vanish, just know that you're not dying. You're transforming. You're becoming part of something vast and strange and very, very old. And somewhere in that vastness, I'll be waiting. See you in the forest." The ranger station filed the notebook away with Kevin's other effects. No one read it carefully. No one connected the patterns. And when October 2028 rolled around with another full moon over Olympic National Park, the rangers on duty that week would be young, new, eager to prove themselves. They would respond to the missing hiker report with professional efficiency. They would organize search and rescue operations. They would walk the Sol Duke Falls Trail calling names that would echo through the cathedral forest. And between the trees, in the spaces where light couldn't quite reach, the absences would be waiting. Patient, hungry, ready to welcome new consciousness into their ancient, endless congregation. Because the forest always keeps what it takes, and the pattern, once established, never truly ends. It just waits 14 years and begins again. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened to Tom and Sophia.